It's recording, right? Oh, yeah, it's recording. Right. Hi. Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for joining for today's roundtable discussion. For today's uh, international relations and foreign policy cluster of the Nickel and Dive or Center for New Economic Studies, we are very much glad to have a discussion on a very imperative topic that fundamentally garners our attention a lot. It's a topic that not only concerns us on a very political level, it's a topic that concerns on us very national level, right? Insofar, when we talk about IR, we talk about foreign policy. It's a topic we need to understand that why a leader's disruption can very much be important for us to understand. Why a leader's acts and policies can be very much important for a bilateral relation point of view or multilateral point of view. It's very important to understand how a leader's decision can very much shape moving forward the discourse of what we know as politics and international relations. It's the second Trump presidency. And for today's discussion, we are fundamentally looking into what Trump 2.0 and the idea of trade was and the economics of it means. To give general overview as to when we start discussion, the Trump's foreign policy fundamentally started back from 2017 and it ended in 2021 during his first tenure. And fundamentally, there's this idea and discourse of protectionism, of America first. That sort of discourse has been very fundamental from Trump's point of view. And that's fundamentally very challenging and very intriguing from a very research point of view because that questions the whole narrative of what international economy is. Is international economy not more for the global stage? Is international economy sort of reverting back to what we know as protectionist economies, where nation states are concerned with their own interests? Not only that, an aggressive foreign policy stand is seen, as we know from the Chinese trade wars, we know about from the retreating from the NAFTA, as we see in 2017, 2021, and the tech wars, which is the direct competition with China and the resultant market volatility. Right? All of these connections, all of these events have a very strong international economical and political connection. That begs the question of what do we see in Trump 2.0? Are you fundamentally looking in some sort of a discourse, or we are expecting some sort of a change? To start with our discussions today, I'd like to introduce the first question I would like for interested participants to answer is that this to what extent does Trump's America First trade doctrine impact the global economy? And when we fundamentally talk about supply chains and economic chains, manufacturing, and the U.S. China trade relations. So we may have the discussion begin. Ah, Shivali, yeah.
Am I clearly audible?
There's a bit of lag. Am I the only one who is facing that lag? Okay, then please continue.
Okay. So first doctrine. So basically, initially, we just have to understand because there was a memorandum that was released on the very first day of his presidency. And in that memorandum, there's a background, there's like different sections about unfair trade, and there's a section that is dedicated to the People's Republic of China. And talking about that, going further into that, so he basically finds how in 2017, with his first presidency, because he says that there was stable supply chains, there was economic growth, and there were decreasing trade deficits and all of that. While that might not necessarily be an accurate depiction of it, because we can't really find a direct correlation between his policies and whatever economic effects happened, we can look at it with reference to his current presidency as well. And in that context, we can also see how he has promised to impose tariffs. And this is very clearly highlighted in the memorandum itself, where he said that he will review and he'll ask his agencies to review the trade relations between China and, if necessary, impose tariffs. An important distinction and what he promised on his campaign was during his campaign, he was very aggressive with the idea of tariffs. And although the idea of tariffs is still being implemented and is still in reality, we can see that China is responding aggressively as well. As mentioned, a very imminent threat of like aggressive trade war with China that is being played out through tariffs. So it's and when we talk about tariffs will inevitably affect those, especially when we talk about China. It will lead to disruptions because companies might seek alternatives that in which we can see that the operations will be shifted to other countries, like even India might be included within those, just for the objective of, and like I already mentioned, the trade war because of the tariffs. Although China has the capability and it has that economic power with itself to actually fight back, there are other countries which might not necessarily have that power. This is with reference to, say, because their economies far more deeply integrated with the US economy. We might see that we are already seeing that Canada is actually pushing for stronger integration with the US rather than in like if we contrast it to China, how it's fighting back, Canada is kind of going in the opposite direction. So, Trump is kind of integrating his other policies and campaign ideals with the America First doctrine. And this relates to, say, immigrants and fentanyl, because he has threatened to impose a 25% tariff on Mexican goods to combat illegal immigrants and to combat illegal goods. So, apart from these, the America First doctrine, it's not just from a point of supply chains and manufacturing, which will obviously be affected, but it's also about niche. And what it means is that although it proclaimed that America first does not mean America alone, the fact of the matter is that it does mean that America will step back from the internet it is a part of right now. From institutions like World Trade Organization, it has already rescinded from the Paris Agreement. And this will create a vacuum that China will most likely step in. And China has been building that role for itself, not just economically, but also that are related to the UN. For example, it has this Global Development Initiative that is continuing on from the idea of Belt and Road Initiative. And so China's role, because of the America First doctrine, because of what it represents, we can definitely expect to see China's role actually become exacerbate on a global stage. And the anymore because the US is actively rescinding itself from the global stage, at least in these matters. It might be accepted at least the domestic economies and governments that aren't necessarily the most stable. So they want to have supply chains where it is their labor and their manpower that is coming to the forefront. And so I'd say that aims to boost domestic production. It aims to boost employment in its own in their own country. Consumers, which is a big plank that was campaigning on. Easy to say succeed or it'll fail, or whether America will completely rescind from the global stage, or it'll shut itself up, it'll be completely protectionist. We can say that the role that it is creating for itself will be very different with the second Trump administration.
Right, I think so. That fundamentally poses two very fundamental ideas. Like first, this America first idea is fundamentally an America stepping back idea, right? So it's a whole idea that a discourse that was created by Obama, which fundamentally transcendent America on a much more global level, which has been taking back, right? And fundamentally, it's a question of how this America first will also affect vis-a-vis other things, and which leads us to our next point and next question at this hand, that this sort of renewed trade war under Trump 2.0, right? Whether this had the capacity to lead to further economic decoupling between major powers, because as the previous speaker has very rightly pointed out, that we see an aggressive China also fighting back, right? So is the America first doctrine very much like the major of powers should be aggressive to each other, right? Or which could be against the conventional academic wisdom, or is there any room for, let's say, negotiation or strategic realignment for that matter? Because if the Trump administration is fundamentally changing the international economics as we know, what is it changing to? The nature of IR is that one thing changes from one to another. So that is the question that I asked the discussions.
Yeah, so Donald Trump's return to the White House is bound to shake up the global economy. His America First approach is built on tariffs, trade wars, and overall rejection of globalization. And this could lead to major shifts in like global trade, finance, and political alliances. But the real question that comes to mind is, will his policies actually reshape the global economy as they're intended to, or will they cause short-term disruptions without actual impact in the long term? So the first question that I thought of when I started researching was, will the US and China completely split economically? So this was one of the biggest fears regarding Trump's return, and it was basically whether he will accelerate the economic separation between the US and China now, or will it be the same as it was? So during his first term, he actually imposed harsh tariffs on Chinese goods, which he hoped to push American companies to stop relying on China. So some fear that this time around he may even go further. So most companies like semiconductor industries, they've already started moving their production to Vietnam, India, and Mexico. And even some industries have started moving to friendlier countries like Japan and South Korea. But what experts feel is that a full breakup between these countries is quite unrealistic. So China is still the world's largest manufacturer in the and it's a key player in like the electronics industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, and even rare earth minerals. So while some industries are bound to shift out of Chi- uh, uh, China, but cutting China completely out of the equations would be very costly and impractical. So while Trump's return may intensify these tensions, a complete split is more of a political slogan rather than an actual reality. The next point that I feel is very important to note is that if these tariffs will actually help the US economy or not. On paper, it might sound like a win, but will it actually work is a very important and pertinent question for this topic. So, in the past, when Trump first imposed tariffs on China in 2018, the costs were mostly passed on to the American consumers and businesses. And a study found that over 90% of the tariffs, their costs were absorbed by the companies, and which led to higher prices for everyday goods. But instead of creating jobs in America, it shifted production again to Mexico or Southeast Asia to avoid tariffs. So we can see from this that it didn't help a lot. It didn't boost the US economy as it intended to. So this led to higher prices but lower growth of the economy. And it made it even harder for the economy to stabilize. So it disrupted businesses, it increased costs for consumers, and it slowed down economic growth. If he doubles down on this approach, the result may even be it may be even more economically uncertain rather than, giving the country a manufacturing boom. The next point that I thought of was, will Trump's policies actually undermine the US dollar or not? So it has been the US dollar, as we all know, has been the dominant global currency. It's used in trade, it's used in finance, international reserves, and basically everything. It's the parity, it's the one we use to compare our local money to and everything. So but his aggressive use of tariffs and sanctions, they could essentially accelerate efforts by other countries to reduce their dependence on the dollar. And we can already see China and Russia have already started to move away from the dollar. They've been increasing trade in their own currencies, and they're working with countries like Brazil, India, and countries in the Middle East to reduce their reliance on the US dollar. And China has even gone as far as to develop a cross-border interbank payment system. It's called the CIPS, and as it's a competitor to SWIFT. So it's a global messaging network for financial transactions, basically. And this is created with the intention to again lower the impact that the US dollar has on the global economy. But the dollar isn't really disappearing anytime soon because it's been dominant for so long. It's going to take a lot of time for it to actually go out of usage. Most countries still use it because it's been dominant for a long time. It's because of its liquidity, security, and because it's globally accepted. So this is going to be a long-term challenge, and it won't be an immediate shift as we've thought. And then Trump's America First policies often been straining relationships with other allies. So during his first term, he's clashed with NATO, he's clashed with the European Union, he's clashed with Japan, and even South Korea. If this if the US continues on its path, the US allies they may start looking for alternative partnerships. The European Union and European leaders might already they've started to strengthen their relationships with China. And if Trump pressures them too much, they might become more independent with their own foreign policy and stop their reliance on US as much as they've done before. And as for India, India could actually benefit from these tensions. So it's well positioned to attract investment and trade partnerships as companies look for alternatives to China. However, I feel Japan and Korea will face very tough decisions because they have deep ties. Both of these countries rely on the US for security, but they also have deep economic ties actually with China. If Trump forces them to take sides, this will most likely cause disruptions and then political strain within the countries. So, towards the end, I'll just say his return would undoubtedly shake the economy. But the main question that I come back to again is whether this will create a lasting change or just temporary disruptions. So the key question isn't what he will do, it's how the rest of the world will adapt, resist, or reshape the system in response.
Right. That is, yeah, comparing points because fundamentally the whole argument is we cannot um, truly say that X will be the direct impact of Trump, but that disruption is the means by we can measure how Trump can essentially go forward. And that's a very rightly point that has been put forward that fundamentally Trump's policies might not be that much problematic for the intended quote unquote enemies, but are very much consequential to the quote unquote allies, right? Which also then fundamentally leads to the next question of the discussion. And again, it's fundamentally relied. And thank you very much for that answer because it loops us back into that question. Is that this acceleration of let's say fragmentation of the global economic system, which is what we say quote unquote under the Trump 2.0, right? Can we now affirmatively say that will it lead to the rise of, let's say, parallel trade or financial infrastructures? Because for a longer duration, the international system, let's say it's the post World War II and fundamentally post the fall of the Berlin Wall, that we have been very much, and the USSR, that we have been very much relied on the Western financial infrastructures, right? Right. Does this mean that this fragmentation or this supposed fragmentation is going to lead to accelerated de-dollarization? We have already seen BRICS expanding into the new BRICS, which has composite more members of, let's say, from the West Asia, and maybe coming up of new trade blocks. So could that be a reality?
Yes, so thank you so much, Jyoth. The short answer would be yes. I rightly believe so. So Trump 2.0 basically has an economic nationalization. As during his election campaign in around sometime in October, he had mentioned that. Quoting him right here, to me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff. And I could not believe when I first came across that. I had to verify that from multiple sources, but it is rightly said so. Someone had mentioned here the terminology rejection to globalization, which is again, I think, a beautiful way to describe it. And essentially, with this nationalization, through his other speeches and through his inaugural speech as well, we can see that, not just currently, but in the past as well, we can see that uh, uh, there is a sort of rise of belief that America needs the America First policy, and they need to focus on themselves, and that sort of in foreign affairs, that they it has been unfair towards the US, and they have benefited less while giving out so much more. So, his America First populist approach, if I might say, it is basically means aggressive tariff policies and potential withdrawal for multilateral trade agreements, as well as we've discussed. And, it will definitely deepen economic polarization. According to the data that is, in process currently. It's still pretty raw, but according to reports and some scholars, there is a blanket tariff on all imports and a triple expected percentage of tariff on China, particularly, and a very significant tariff on countries that move away from the US dollar. I'm not really sure on how the Washington plans to determine what moving away from dollar is exactly, but they do not have sort of a good mindset or good attitude towards that, and further undermining his um, nationalist approach or his sentiments. Uh, Sorry, further undermining his nationalist sentiments, there is also a very massive trade tariff coming up on the Mexican built vehicles, which can obviously not just that is a very regional kind of a disruption, but the repercussions will be felt globally as well. So further, further when we talk about de-dollarization, which is what you mentioned in your question, so his attempt to push countries is basically moving away from the dollar, and it has inadvertently fueled a global de-dollarization effort, and major economies, including China, Russia, even European nations to some extent, are expanding their use of alternative currencies in trade. So, for example, there is a rise in the Chinese yuan and the relevance of central bank digital currencies, and of course, BRICS that we will get to in a bit. And again, going back to 2017, when Trump first came in power, it was completely unexpected, and stock market or the market in general is very dependent on prediction and analysis and data interpretations, and it was a very big shock to the world itself that with such wavering certainty that Trump had won the majority. So the stock market essentially shook to its core, and currently there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding trade. And which has also resulted in a lot of instability in equity markets, and especially sectors that are heavily reliant on international trade, such as technology, manufacturing, automotive industries, they are experiencing very sharp fluctuations. And trade barriers have significantly impacted commodity markets as well, particularly in energy, metals, and agriculture. With countries imposing counter tariffs, global trade is essential in goods, and it has become essentially very unpredictable and leading to supply chain disruptions as well. Now, when it comes to rise of parallel trade, to shift our attention towards the second half of your question, uh, So basically, we are faced with a mounting, the world is faced with mounting trade barriers. And countries are actively seeking to reduce dependence on the US because there is a sense of panic in the international community with this. So most of these, the most promising of this appears to be according to the data itself, and not just currently, over the past few years, a regional, a grouping that has sort of emerged is the BRICS Plus, which essentially consists of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And now, with so many countries flourishing, so many countries swarming in to join it. So the BRICS nations have been working on strengthening intra-group trade through local currency and settlement infrastructure investments and financial institutions like the New Development Bank. Uh, and the addition of basically with the addition of new BRICS members, the bloc is increasingly positioning itself to a counterbalance in Western-led economic institutions. Additionally, there are Asian trades like ASEAN, which in which these nations are insulating themselves from Washington's economic unpredictability. The RCEP is deepening trade ties, and we also see some possibility of a strategic autonomy push in EU because of its push through in recently in digital euro initiatives, energy diversification, and policy independence, industrial policy independence, just to be specific here. And of course, we've talked very uh, we've talked about the Paris climate agreement. So his notorious withdrawal from the Paris agreement in 2020 is very significant in this regard. And although the Biden administration managed to put America back in the sustainability game, it is likely that Trump might aim to undo this move. Now, this is not just an economic uncertainty. This is also a very big policy, or sort of like a very big shake to multilateralism in itself. So I would like to bring in the factor of when US was the hegemon and how it shaped the world order in itself. For example, the UN is very heavily influenced by the US itself. So in a lot of if we see less of a role in the US, and if we see so much uncertainty towards the Paris Agreement, which was a landmark agreement in a very pertinent international issue, then of course, it further also pushes for reforms and questions the relevance of the UN, or any international organization that US is a part of, owing to its influence and the heavy I would say taxes or the donations that US plays. So just to bring in a point, I would like to sort of pause here and come back to this in a later part of our discussion. Uh, a very important factor is the global south, which we see through China, and we see through the Paris Agreement as well to some extent. So there is a sort of divide in the global south and global north countries, is particularly over the issue of climate change and carbon emissions. And there were talks of, and there were promises of reparations and technology transfer. So, of course, the US leading the global north in a manner, so to speak. These countries will be definitely forced to, the global south will definitely be forced to, be self-sufficient and push in itself to uh, move on to more sustainable measures and to alternative fuel efficiencies. And of course, if we further go into the global south, just some food for thought that we can come back to later, that China is definitely, for the lack of a better word, the target here. So I'm just wondering as to how, I'm curious to see how the global south will sort of, emerge from this or deal with this situation. So yes, that's all. Thank you.
Least to say that insights have been quite fruitful, because it fundamentally questions not how we understand Trump's actions, how we understand international community's actions, because I think a lot of the scholarly debates sort of forget that we cannot be only Trump centric, right? And that's a very futile problem in the IR scholarships that we sort of center around from one centerpiece and we think that that's how the world analyzes. But we end up forgetting that in order for Trump to be superpower, there has to be other countries and they have to react in a certain way that they allow them to be superpower. So how much is it the other countries react is a fundamental question, and even the international organization, how that reacts is a fundamental question that we should not and should not forget, right? Which also leads to a very, let's say, sort of a conclusionist. If you're aiming for some sort of a conclusion or a fit list arguments, right? That we have an idea that there's some sort of an uncertainty we are going through, right? But the question remains is that in what like fundamental ways, right? We see like a complete reshaping of the global order. We have talked about elements that I've touched. We have talked about a question of a parallel trade. We have talked about the question of like whether that uncertainty will lead to an actual long-term change, right? But the question still remains that in what fundamental ways we can see Trump in the next 4 to 5 years completely reshaping the global economic order, and particularly when it comes to the questions of trade alliances, protectionist policies, and broader shift towards economic nationalism. Because fundamentally, we need to understand that we are in a global era where we are dealing with a lot of conflicts. So, how would that be reacted? So, I throw this the question before moving to the general end. Yeah, Alexandra, do you want to comment to this?
Yes. So yes. So in my turn, I'd like to discuss a question. How will Donald Trump's policies shape the world's economic landscape? And well, to begin with, Donald Trump's approach to trade is quite straightforward. I will say that he doesn't emphasize multilateral agreements. In his first term, we saw him pull the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it's likely that this trend will continue. So instead of working within large international agreements, Trump prefers bilateral trade deals. A second term will likely see more deals made on a country-by-country basis, and aiming to secure favorable conditions for the United States. In fact, Trump's administration has already signaled that it will push harder for the reorganizations of existing deals, like an FTA now replaced by USMCA. And let's not forget that Trump has promised to impose significant tariffs on imports, ranging from 10% to 20% on goods from around the world, and as high as 60% on Chinese products. So the next question is, how might these tariffs affect the United States and the world economy? So while many of these policies may sound radical, they resonate with many American voters, especially those burdened by rising prices in everyday goods. However, there is a flip side. These protectionist measures could lead to inflation in the United States, which would not only hurt American consumers, but also undermine other countries' ability to borrow money. We may even see the Federal Reserve hesitate to cut interest rate further, and the Bank of England could follow suit. It's just I just read a few like articles in the UK media, so this is why, and tightening global financial conditions. Moreover, countries like Mexico, the Eurozone, and parts of Central and Eastern Europe could bear the brunt of Trump's aggressive tariffs. These regions are deeply embedded in global trade, especially with the United States. So disruptions to their economic relationship could be a cascading effect on global growth. So what I also like to discuss is how Trump's policies impact international trade alliances. So Trump's focus on economic nationalism means that traditional alliances could face serious challenges. For example, his preferences for bilateral agreements over multilateral ones could result in fewer partnerships, thus, in turn, could reduce market turnover and hinder the growth of emerging markets, which depend heavily on trade. And also, we've already seen this tariff in his this shift in his first term. Trump signed the U.S. Out of the TPP, and he appointed figures like Robert Lighthizer and Peter Navarro to key positions. And these men have deep ties to protectionist policies, and they likely continue to drive the administration's trade strategy. So, what goes that mean for smaller players in the global economy? Um, well, I think smaller businesses and freelancers, particularly those in Europe or countries closely tied to the US, markets might feel the impact. The uncertainty caused by reduced international agreements could hurt small businesses that rely on the stability of transatlantic trade. Essentially, while large corporations might benefit from tax cuts and deregulation, the costs will trickle down to workers who could see fewer job opportunities and wage stagnation. So we could also discuss domestic economy and maybe how Trump's policies can reshape industries. May I ask a question whether I can still have time to speak, or is it fine?
Yeah. Do you have any other more points?
I mean, maybe I could also discuss the global consequences of Trump's economic nationalism.
So, I mean, already quite enriching points. We are going to move on to the final question, then we can take everyone's remarks. Is that fine?
Okay. So,
yeah.
Should I conclude?
Yeah, just let me bring in the concluding question, right? Just for a second, right? Because I think your points. So we'll take concluding remarks from everyone, right? So then you can conclude. The fundamental thing that I probably forgot my argument. Yeah, the fundamental thing that is very much important to understand is that this sort of changing needs to be understood from all the holistic perspective. And yeah, this sort of brings to our final question, and I would like all the speakers to give their concluding remarks on this. That um, what are the key takeaways, or let's say a long-term trend do you see to shape the future of international economic relations? Because by now, all the four of the discussions have very much purely centered upon the fact that vis-a-vis how Trump would impact, right? But what are the key takeaways, let's say, for us to tell to other people that, oh, this is how we're gonna see the international economics to see in the next years? Shivali, if we can we begin with your concluding points?
So I think this is kind of a pop-out answer, but the matter of fact is we can't really know, or we can make guesses. But personally, from whatever research I've done, I feel like there's a lot of conflicting accounts of what might happen. And obviously it's impacted by who is looking at what scale. For example, if we're looking at, like, say, the energy sector, there's actually major oil and gas companies that say domestic production will not actually increase. And connecting, going on from that point, there's also other trends, like for example, there's decoupling, there's AI that's rising, and it could be seen that China will play a stronger role in these sectors purely because of the doctrine of America first. And if we see with relation to, say, clean and green energy technologies, because the America is taking step back from renewable energies and it's stopping production of, say, or allowing sites for wind power and all of that, China will probably take that opportunity as well, and it'll become a major player, which it already is, but it'll take more share of the energy market. So I think the trend that we can expect going forward is China taking a greater role in sectors that might not have been as easily be able to break into because of the way the administration is focusing on domestic production and bringing prices down for their consumers. Another thing is also the relations between I would say that the way US is handling diplomatic affairs, even that might it will obviously have an effect on the economic side of things when we look at say trade with Russia, or the way that Trump is handling the affairs with Russia, and how that will impact oil and gas markets and prices and all of that, and how even Russia will be impacted by the fact that they might not have the kind of means to fund their military expeditions. And so I would basically say, because of the actions that US is taking at this point, we can it might not be entirely adverse, purely because, if we again moving back to the energy sector, because of the removal of red tape, if the cards are played correctly, it would also mean removal of red tape for projects around renewable energy. So the thing is, it's not entirely a pessimistic picture. There is a lot to be like scared for and like disappointed about, but I feel like maybe the economy could pull through. Thank you.
Fair argument. Tarni, would love to conclude your remarks.
Yeah. So to conclude, I think we can take 2 or 3 points out of this entire discussion. We can see a slow and steady shift away from the dollar dominance that's happening. So obviously the US dollar will not be replaced overnight, but I feel alternative trade and financial systems will continue to emerge, and with the yuan, instead of the yuan replacing the dollar, I feel we just might see a more balanced system. Maybe the euro, the yuan, or even digital currencies might take on a larger role, but the dollar will still remain like the backbone of global finance. The real trend is not to shift a total shift to the yuan, but more of the rise of multiple power centers in global trade. And secondly, I feel we can see more regional trade blocks, and especially with countries being very wary of US sanctions, they might just try to strengthen regional deals like BRICS trade agreements and all. So, and obviously with China's SIPs, which is quite literally an alternative to the SWIFT system, it might just grow to bypass Western dominated banking systems. And China's role in global finance will grow, but with its limits. So the China's capital control, lack of transparency, and economic risks these factors will definitely limit how far it can go. But somehow, I feel US China tensions, these will push more industries to move production to countries like India and Mexico, and other strategic sectors which require more technical expertise. I feel they might move to nations that are more friendly with the US. So, and other, I feel there's a very uncertain future for global trade institutions like the WTO. And they might just lose their influence if Trump's policies, his perfectionist policies, if I may, they continue. So more countries might follow this trend, and they might ignore global rules and shift to just having bilateral trade, or even ignore regional deals. So these are my concluding remarks.
Right. Purvi, the question of
Thank
global
you.
south, as you said. Yeah.
Okay, before we move on to the global south, I just want to put it out there that we're still into very early into the year, and sort of what to see. It's just been a few weeks, so we're in the very early stages of understanding both the timing and the magnitude at which all of these will translate into policy, or even a trend per se, or what the question said. So it's very hard to have an accurate forecasting. But of course, I would say that with the direction of change, I strongly believe that this will finally, if this continues and if there's a strong nationalist and protectionism of basically the US, could definitely lead to the decline of, finally the end of an era where the US had its, cultural, economic, and military I mean, to some extent, yes, so I see a very strong decline in the US's influence, or at least its interplay into the international, scenario. I'm not really sure about. I'm not sure on who will sort of rise as the victor, or who will sort of take over, whether it's China, whether it's more like a multipolar approach. But for sure, we can see a very decline in which US will sort of have to take a back seat and focus more on its internal policies. Um, uh, so as far as the question of the global south comes into play, it's essentially ties to this itself, that with the decline of the US, there are a lot of questions that will sort of be left unanswered, or hanging into the air, as who will be the regulator, who will be sort of like, who will take over these questions, responsibilities in the sense. And countries, again, reiterating my point, will be forced to be self-sufficient. But for banks, for industries, various textile industries, or be it manufacturing industries, transportation and energy, you might see some huge fluctuations, and probably like an upside in the equity markets. And of course, there is also like a huge implication of strained relations with its allies, and the US may adopt a more confrontational approach towards its allies. And in the long term, the international economic trends under a second Trump presidency could definitely lead to the global south in itself facing a new set of difficulties, I would like to say, like moving on from the so long, uncertainty of, the funding, the climate funding per se.
Oh yeah, Alexandra, we will your concluding remarks for the discussion.
Yes. Uh, yes. So I have a few remarks. So first of all, yes, I'd like to underline the significance of the economical nationalism of Trump. And just what I want to say is that this trend might strengthen some domestic industries and reduce foreign competition, but it also can lead to high inflation, weaker global institutions, and more tensions with trading partners. Also, I'd like to add some more information about the shift from the dollar dominancy, and adding some information to the technical advantage. So what I've recently read was that by 2030, technological advancement, especially in AI, 5G, and renewable energy, will significantly impact the economies of the United States, as well as the global economy and international relations. So those technologies and the ability to set standards for their development and use will actually reshape the power of both state and non-state actors. And I think this ability to access all the types of transitions of whatever currencies will actually create new winners and losers. So while the development of medical technologies and pandemic control devices is beyond the scope of the discussion, it's clear that the technological progress list will actually bring major changes for the United States and like the globe.
Right. I guess the least I could say that it was a fundamentally enriching discussion, and yes, the uncertainty is definite, the challenges are there, but yeah, Trump disruption is always a disruption that we all see, and we have to face, we have to see how it goes. But despite that, wonderful discussion on this, and I thank you all of the members here who have enriched this discussion. Fundamentally, we covered every other point, and if you think about it, we have not missed any other point, like, and if we have missed something, it must have been covered because that was so enriching, that it was so dense in its own nature. So thank you very much for joining for the discussion, and thank you very much for your points as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.